Thank you, Francis, and good morning, everyone. I am glad that we are all here, that we all made it. I know that some of you had some trouble in entering into the building, but it's a pleasure for me to be able to be here with such an intimate and distinguished group of people who think deeply about issues that I care about. You may have heard of my grandfather, Alexandra Cousteau. And it might not surprise you that when I was 3 months old, I took my first swimming lesson and went on expedition. Just a month later, when I was 4 months old, I explored South America and Africa in the arms of my father, Philippe. I was water safe by the time I was a year, could swim across a pool, and my grandfather then taught me to scuba dive when I was 7. So it's safe to say that they brainwashed me from a very early age to do what I do. But it's also safe to say that growing up with my family, there was never anything else that I wanted to do. When my grandfather invented scuba diving after World War II, 70 years ago, he was discovering and sharing an ocean that was remarkable in its abundance, in its diversity, its resilience. It was a place that was full of life. And the images that he captured there inspired awe and wonder in people around the world. And I have spent my life traveling around the world, talking to people who have shared their Cousteau stories with me, told me about how watching his films with their father when they were a little boy or a little girl was their best memory of childhood. There was one guy who told me that he would not be allowed to watch my grandfather's films. And when I asked him why, he said that his parents wouldn't let him watch the films because he would get so excited that he would start to hyperventilate. He would jump up and down on the couch, yelling at my grandfather not to go into the water because there were sharks or not to go into the cave because it was dangerous. Another guy who told me that after watching my grandfather's films, he would put on his mask and snorkel and get into the tub and pretend that he was a crew member of the Calypso and he was exploring the oceans too. And that is remarkable because my grandfather did something that had never been done before, that today we take for granted. We remember him for his red hat and we remember him for the Calypso, but what he really did was create the first truly global media experience where people from around the world, regardless of their gender, their creed, their nationality, their culture, felt the same feelings as they watched his stories unfold on the screen. And I had very much the same experience, except that oftentimes I was with him, doing what he did. And yet, over the course of my life, the places that I knew and loved as a child, places that I imagined taking my own children one day, have disappeared, almost all of them. There may be places that you knew as a child that if you were to go back there today would not be the same place that you remember. And it became clear to me when my own children were born that they could be the generation of my family that writes the obituary for the world's oceans. Now, these are heavy thoughts for a conversation first thing in the morning, but I then had a call with a good friend of mine that you heard from yesterday, Professor Carlos Durante. And I asked him, I said, Carlos, is it inevitable that my children write the obituary for the world's oceans? Or is it possible that perhaps we could rebuild our oceans to the abundance that my grandfather once knew? Is that something that we could do by 2050? Or will there be more plastic than oceans, as we read in the papers? And he told me, and this was in 2018, he said, Alexandra, actually, it is possible to restore abundance to our oceans. It's not inevitable that they die. And I'm writing a paper about this right now with some of the world's best scientists called Rebuilding Marine Life. And that paper was then published in Nature. And it became one of the top 5 climate papers that was published that year. And what was remarkable about this paper, and I don't know if he talked to you about it yesterday, was that it laid out a roadmap for how to rebuild our oceans by 2050. All the things we need to do. And that's unusual for science, because usually scientists tell us all the things that are going wrong, and not enough about how we can move forward. But the truth is that without a vision of where to go, we end up reacting our way into the future. We just react. And that, honestly, is what the conservation movement has been doing for the past 60 years. We just react. And so, if it is possible to rebuild abundant oceans by 2050, and we know that the science tells us it's true, then in order to get to that future, we have to imagine it. We have to believe it's possible. We have to share a vision of what that future is so that we can work together to build a roadmap to get there. And we don't have that roadmap yet, but that's what we've been working on at Oceans 2050 for the past 4 years, with Carlos's guidance as our chief scientist. Now, that's the oceans, but 10 years ago, I decided that I had spent my life in the oceans, and yet, as a little girl, I learned about the water cycle. We all did. And the water cycle clearly shows us that our fresh water and our oceans are connected. It goes in a big circle. And so I went on a 2-year journey around the world and then around North America, looking at the intersection of fresh and salt water. And it is remarkable that those two bodies of water are so siloed in our society because they are so intimately connected. And one of the great examples that I explored along the way was the Colorado River. How many of you know that the Colorado River dies in the Mexican desert? Okay, that's because you're a very distinguished group of people. Most people don't realize that. But it does. So we started at the headwaters of the Colorado and worked our way all the way down and saw where it dies in the Mexican desert and what that does to the communities in the Gulf. And what is so remarkable to me is that that cycle is broken up by barriers, it's broken up by legislation, it's broken up by all these things, and it's ultimately not just the environment that suffers, but the people as well. So fishermen that used to be able to fish in the Sea of Cortez are now making tortillas because there's no more fish, because the fresh water that used to go in to the Sea of Cortez and create the conditions for life to thrive is gone. A few years after we were there was a project between scientists and activists and government agencies in both the US and Mexico to reconnect the Colorado River to the sea. And they believed that if the Colorado River could meet the sea just once, that we would see a flush of life both on land and in the ocean. And that is exactly what happened. After years of complete desertification, life came back. The little seeds, the little eggs, the little sources of life were able to thrive with the water that came. And that is a really important reminder that it's not too late. That even though we have lost half the life in our ocean since my grandfather first started exploring, that microplastics and pollution and overfishing and all of these other things that are destroying our oceans continue to flow into them, that we are overusing and polluting the fresh water we depend on. And the climate change is creating a situation that's going to be really hard for us to manage. It's not too late. And the reason I say this is because when my grandfather was asked how he was able to do all the things that he did, he answered that it was because he inhabited his lucky moment in time. What he meant by that is that when he left the French Navy, where he had been an intelligence officer and a member of the French Resistance, and he was there thinking about what was next. He had a passion for invention and innovation. He was one of those children that always take things apart and put them back together again. He made films as a child, black and white films of villains, and he was always the villain, kidnapping the woman in his films. He had these passions, and at the same time, television had been invented. There were only 2 channels and no content. People had sort of gone underwater, but no one had invented scuba diving, or underwater lights, or underwater cameras, or underwater sound, or scooters, or submersibles. And when he went to Hollywood with this idea that he wanted to have these oceanographic campaigns on this boat that he just got that was a former ferry boat and minesweeper called the Calypso, they said, sounds interesting, but you've got to jazz it up a little bit. You've got to, make it fancy. And so he did. He said, I know exactly what to do. And he went back and he got the red hat and he got the yellow stripes on the black suits and he put a slide on the back of the Calypso so that his divers could slide right into the water head first. And he put an observation bubble on the front and he put a light on these helmets that he made his divers wear underwater that they hated, but that looked really good on camera. And he went back to Hollywood and they said, you got it. Let's get started. And they did the first series of the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau. And what I realized today, as his lucky moment unfolded for him, a moment that wouldn't have happened 10 years before or 10 years later, because it was that moment when everything coincided to make it possible for him to do what he did, that we have a lucky moment in time today. We have AI and big data and technology that we never had before. We're able to track illegal fishermen from space. We're even able to look at the faces of their crew to look for forced labor at sea. There are things that we can do, that we can imagine now, that we could never have imagined doing before. More interestingly, though, when you look at what he did with film and television and books and radio, he was using the most cutting-edge technology he had at the time to give people an opportunity to write themselves into the story. What we have today is a very different but even more powerful opportunity to allow people to write them into the story of rebuilding abundance to our oceans and to our world. Because think about the games that we play. Think about the fact that you have a device in your pocket where if you take it out and you tap on it 8 times in the right place, you can walk out of here. A car will pull up, know exactly where you want to go, and when you open the door, they'll say hello to you and use your first name. Think about what we can manifest in the real world with the technology that we've created. 15 years ago, that would have felt impossible, and yet today we take it for granted. You can tap on that same device in the right place a few times and get on a plane to Rio, have a car waiting for you, know the code to a lockbox, to an apartment that you selected out of all the apartments in Rio because it has a nice balcony and you like the bedding, right? These things are remarkable. And yet when it comes to restoring abundance to our oceans, we're so often still using Stone Age technology. We're hanging fragments of corals on strings, placing them out in the reef, hoping they'll regrow. But we're losing 2.5 acres of coral every minute. We're sending tourists to space. but we haven't figured out how to keep up with the loss of one of the most critical ecosystems in our ocean. Yet that technology exists for other industries. So the truth is, when it comes to our oceans, the future is here. And it's just not evenly distributed. Same is true with our fresh water. And so the question is, if we want to have a vision of where to go, if we have a vision of where to go, then why don't we use the tools we use in all of these other industries to give people the agency to imagine that future together and work towards it in a collaborative way? The games that we've spent billions of dollars creating, where we go and we play and we fight and we shoot, oftentimes in a dystopian future world. It's fun for people. There's nothing wrong with that. But what if we could also use those tools to co-create the future that we want? To be able to build in that game, but have real world outcomes. These are all things that technology tells us is possible, and yet we haven't tried to bring in to the world. And I think that that is where I see the great opportunity of our time. The ability that my grandfather had to take advantage of his lucky moment in time today doesn't mean having a bigger boat or doing more of what he did 70 years ago. It means looking at all of these tools that we have, putting them together to tackle one of the greatest challenges that we have. And I do believe that this is our lucky moment in time, where we can be ambitious, where we can have a vision of where we want to go, we can collaborate to rebuild these ecosystems that we depend on, and we can do so in a way that is a win-win for everyone, for industry, for policy, most importantly, for our children and our grandchildren, who deserve an abundant future. So I'm going to close my remarks there, and I wanted to make sure that I had enough time to answer any questions that you might have, because this intimate and very distinguished group of people, I'm sure, has many questions for me.